Every banned torture method explained. Lock the frickin' chat.
Torture is undoubtedly one of humanity's oldest and darkest pastimes. And interestingly, torture literally predates recorded history itself. Almost every civilization in almost every time period has used torture in some way, shape, or form. Although the methods of this torture and reasons for this torture vary dramatically. And it wasn't until extremely recently that torture was outright banned globally. Which brings us to the point of today's video. Although torture in the modern day is outright banned, the specifics of that ban, as well as the effectiveness of that ban, are debatable.
We all know that it's not banned, bro. We all know it's not banned, bro.
Which is why in this video, I'm going to discuss every banned and illegal torture method. Starting by discussing the ancient origins of torture, and then mentioning a few notable examples in history where torture was legal but regulated, and finishing with a laser focus on every banned and illegal torture method in the modern day, as well as a few notable breaches of this modern day torture ban. Because unsurprisingly, some countries like to try to bend the rules or downright ignore the rules altogether.
I'm gonna guarantee that the United States has violated the ban more than any other country on this list, probably.
Let's begin. Torture's ancient origins. The ancient origins of torture come in two primary forms: physical evidence and recorded evidence. Let's focus on the first. Currently, the oldest physical
I think China and Japan as well, or Russia. Probably China, yeah.
Evidence we have of humans torturing each other date all the way back to 5200 BC, roughly 7,000 years ago. This physical evidence comes in the form of a Neolithic mass grave. This mass grave was discovered in 2006 when archaeologists were called to a site after construction workers building a road reported finding human bones in a ditch they were digging beside the road.
Dude, imagine just working your 9 to 5 job, digging up something for a construction site and just seeing hella bones. Dude.
After doing some research, these archaeologists were able to determine that these bodies were over 7,000 years old. And these bodies likely belonged to a group of early farmers that lived in the area. Interestingly and morbidly, in this 7-meter-long pit that was excavated by archaeologists, they were able to find the skeletons of over 26 individuals. However, the assortment of these skeletons was odd, and the conditions of these skeletons were even more odd. For starters, seemingly most of the bodies that were buried in this pit suffered substantial and peculiar damage. Many of these skeletons not only displayed fractured skulls, arrow injuries, and signs of blunt force trauma, they also showed the deliberate destruction and mutilation of the leg bones. Something that
I really appreciate the Minecraft sound effects while they're talking about being tortured. It's like they were struck by arrows. Bling!
Archaeologists saw is extremely odd. When you couple this fact with the fact that these skeletons did not just belong to adult men, but they also belonged to men, women, and children, meaning that these weren't soldiers, these were simply civilians and farmers, it becomes obvious that these injuries weren't consistent with normal death. And the conclusion that archaeologists and researchers came to was these individuals were the victims of a deliberate torture. Now, whether or not these individuals were tortured while they were alive, or they simply had their bodies mutilated after they died, is debated. Although most researchers and archaeologists working on this project do generally agree that the way that these bodies were scattered in the mass grave, the condition that they were left in, and also the makeup of the individuals in this group are not consistent with any other sort of outcome other than an intentional and methodical destruction and torture of these individuals, shining a rather dark light on the final moments of these individuals as well as the time frame as a whole. This is in no way, shape, or form the first time a human has ever tortured another human.
So is that just is this just telling the origins of torture? Is that just what it is?
The oldest recorded
torture. That's it. We don't know how they were tortured. We just know they were tortured.
Individuals likely suffered is beyond brutal. The fact their bodies are able to tell the story of their death nearly 7,000 years later is rather interesting, albeit in a rather morbid and upsetting way. But moving on from the first physical evidence of torture, let's now discuss the first recorded evidence of torture.
Recorded evidence?
Much later in history, roughly 3,000 years later, or roughly 4,000 years ago from today, in the mid to late 1770s BC. During this time, the ancient city of Babylon was thriving in ancient Mesopotamia. And while there's plenty of things we could talk about in regards to the ancient Babylonians, one of the most relevant parts of their lore I want to discuss is their exceptional record keeping. Most notably, a legal text known as the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi is far from the first ever written record, and it actually came thousands of years after the ancient Sumerians invented the written word and record keeping as an activity. However, the Code of Hammurabi would introduce a first of its own. as it was the first ever piece of recorded text that would mention torture by name,
Oh.
and it did so in a legal context.
Oh.
The Code of Hammurabi mentions countless laws. However, the one most relevant to this video is law number 153, and this law states explicitly, quote, "If a woman bring about the death of her husband for the sake of another man, they shall impale both of them." Now,
Wait, what?
the death of
If
her
a woman bring about the death of her husband, so if a woman causes the man to die,
husband for the sake of another man, they shall impale both of them. Now, in case
meaning they both die, meaning both the women and I get it.
what that's essentially saying is that if a woman is cheating on her husband and decides to conspire with her new boyfriend to kill her husband, both the wife and the boyfriend should be impaled for their crime.
Yes, I
Now,
agree.
While that alone is interesting enough, obviously the most interesting part is that the punishment mentioned by name was being impaled. And while yes, you could argue that
Okay, I know about the impale part.
that being impaled is a method of execution, when you have an execution method that is so painful, so drawn out, and typically done in a public fashion to humiliate the victim as they die, I think it's hard to argue that execution doesn't also serve as a torture method. And therefore, the Code of Hammurabi made history by being the first ever recorded
good, Matt.
reference of torture. And yet, we're just getting started. Early torture regulations. Although we're about to
Okay.
discuss a small handful of civilizations where torture was relatively common, almost paradoxically, torture had its own code of ethics, or at least rules of conduct.
Okay.
Which to me kind of suggests, even though on a societal level, torture may have been used for one reason or another, on a personal level, it appears that most people knew that torture was something that was objectively bad. Which brings us to this entire section. Now, quickly, it's worth mentioning that in these early examples of torture regulation, there aren't many cases where a specific torture method is outright banned. But don't worry, we're getting there. What we do see in these early cases of torture regulation is the outright ban of the use of torture in certain contexts and on certain groups of people. And of course, these early regulations and laws turn into what will eventually become the banning of specific torture methods and eventually the
You know what's funny? I asked my friend to waterboard me in college. I want to know what it felt like. Fun time.
outright ban of torture altogether, which is why it's worth mentioning this brief history, albeit quickly. Let's pick up exactly where we left off in ancient Babylon. Like I just mentioned in the previous section, the Code of Hammurabi, the legal code of Babylon, has the
Aren't you lurking, Nani? Did you unlurk just to say what the hell?
first ever recorded mention of torture, which is interesting, but it's also not that cut and dry. You see, the Code of Hammurabi suggests that Babylonian culture was simply not using torture for no apparent reason. It instead suggested that these torture methods be regulated under the guide of an eye for an eye, essentially meaning the severity of your crime should match the severity of your punishment. Which lines
Okay.
up exactly with the example I gave earlier, where a wife and her secret boyfriend end up killing her husband. They will both suffer torture and death because they caused death on her husband.
Makes
Whether
sense,
or
makes
not that is
sense.
moral or just is up to you to decide.
I saw that,
However,
RM.
That's how it was done at the time. And the ancient Babylonians and the Code of Hammurabi, if nothing else, prove that torture was common and literally used to enforce the law. It was also regulated to only be a punishment, and a fitting punishment at that.
Dude, why do they keep showing this guy with the... Why is he holding that? Like, why do they keep showing him?
Now, whether or not these guidelines were followed even a little, if at all, is another story. However, if nothing else, there was at least a written suggestion on how torture should be used. Skipping ahead over 1,000 years from ancient Babylon to ancient Greece, we have an entirely new set of rules surrounding torture. And even though we have over 1,000 years of societal and human development and progress, it almost seems like the rules around torture took one or numerous steps backwards. In ancient Greece, there was no formal ban of torture.
I feel like it's about to get crazy with ancient Greece.
However, there was a general exemption of torture for all civilians. However, it's important to understand who is and isn't a civilian in ancient Greece. Civilian doesn't just mean non-member of the military. It also means non-slave and non-foreigner. And both of those groups of people weren't necessarily uncommon in ancient Greece, meaning that torture also wasn't uncommon. But it gets worse. In ancient Babylon, it was at least suggested that torture only be used as a punishment for a crime, and that the severity of the punishment be equal to the severity
That's
of the
fair.
crime. However, in ancient Greece, While torture could be used as a punishment, it was also more commonly used as a method of collecting testimony. And the reason for this is because in ancient Greece, if there was an ongoing legal situation and a slave had evidence that could be helpful in this legal situation, a slave could not simply offer evidence, as slave evidence was often only admissible under duress. Which, to put in simple terms, essentially means evidence from slaves was simply not to be trusted unless the information was offered during torture.
Wait, what? Am I slow to not understand that? So slaves couldn't give out information unless they were tortured? Are we all on the same page here? I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here.
Which, to put in simple terms,
Okay.
slave evidence was often only admissible under duress. Which, to put in simple terms, essentially means evidence from slaves was simply not to be trusted unless the information was offered during torture. So if you were a slave in
But
ancient
why?
Greece and you saw somebody kill somebody and you wanted to go report that to whoever, your word essentially meant nothing. And even if you went to go tell them the truth, they couldn't take that at face value, and they would have to beat you and torture you until you would then say the same thing for it to then be trusted and believed.
Am I stupid, or does that not make any sense? I mean, I guess it does, because slaves obviously were seen as like a lower class back then, so I guess that makes sense.
Talk about brutal. And in ancient Rome, they had a similar yet different code of conduct when it came to torture as well. For starters, Roman citizens, just like Greek citizens, were typically exempt from torture. However, in ancient Rome, there was some exceptions where if you were charged with treason, then you would essentially lose your right to not being tortured. On top of that, just like ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, slaves were also routinely tortured both for punishments and testimonies. And on top of just slaves being tortured, free people that were just poor were also tortured simply for having a lower economic and social status.
Dude, people were barbarians back then, man. Oh my goodness. Imagine just because you're poor, you're just getting tortured. Oh, you're broke? Here's a freaking axe to your forehead.
But as brutal as it is, Roman law did eventually progress to be a little bit more just, at least partly. In later Roman history, under the rule of certain rulers, like Augustus for example, there was laws in place that did require prior evidence to be shown before torture could be used in certain legal cases.
Okay,
which was at least
there we
a
go.
step in the right direction. However, what the requirements for this prior evidence were, and how harshly it was scrutinized, are debatable. Regardless, it was at least some sort of progress.
So some progress, but they didn't really take into effect too much.
Which leads us to our final example of ancient torture regulations. Emperor Ashoka was the ruler of the Mauryan Empire in 3rd century BC India. In
Okay.
India at the time, just like
India.
every other civilization, torture was common and served its purpose in society. However, interestingly, Emperor Ashoka started to see torture's role in society differently after converting to Buddhism. It's been reported that after Emperor Ashoka became a Buddhist, he began promoting something known as Dhamma, or moral law, a concept that is foundational in many Eastern religions, most notably Buddhism. With this new promotion of moral law, Emperor Ashoka would urge his officials to avoid unjust punishments, or even torture altogether, emphasizing a legal approach of mercy, nonviolence, and humane treatment of individuals.
Very good. Very good, Buddhist. Very good. I like that. That's good. Very good. W.
It may have took nearly 2,000 years, but we finally found another civilization that would not only offer an eye for an eye, but also notice that two wrongs don't make a right. Although, once again, this wasn't an outright formal ban or a rule that was hardly followed. In the Mauryan Empire, there was still plenty of torture used. However,
Dude, they keep showing this masked guy, bro. Why?
progress was being made. And I did want to highlight these examples of torture regulation through history, as they do show glimmers of what would later become the progression of human society. And with that, new moral values and new laws, which we can finally discuss. Modern torture bans.
Finally, we're getting to the juicy stuff now, chat. It's crazy that someone had to be like, hey guys, maybe we should do that. Like, literally 2,000 years. It's insane that 2,000 years later, someone was like, you know what? Maybe this torture thing, not good. Maybe we shouldn't like just kill people because they're homeless.
Now I know, up until now, I haven't mentioned any specific methods of torture that have been banned. All we've been able to discuss so far is ways in which torture usage was banned, which is at least a start. But with modern torture bans, we're able to really see an acceleration of the banning of torture methods. And interestingly,
ready for
the
this.
approach is more or less 0 to 100. In every civilization
Great.
and time period we've discussed, essentially all forms of torture were at least somewhat viable by the government, at least in some context. However, something we see in modern times is not just the ban for certain torture methods, but the ban for torture as a whole. One of the earliest notable advocates for the banning of torture across all of Europe is a man named Cesare Beccaria. He was an Italian philosopher and criminologist.
Okay.
He was very vocal about his beliefs in torture being ineffective, unjust, and downright barbaric. And
Let me guess, they tortured him because he said that.
while he personally had no political power and wasn't able to enact legislative change himself, his views and opinions quickly spread across both European and American colonies, really causing individuals to question whether or not torture had a place in modern-day society. And unsurprisingly, what followed the popularity of this thought process was a wave of torture abolitions across most and eventually all of Europe. Sweden, Austria, France, and England were some of the first
England
to ban judicial torture. However, by the late 1800s, almost every country in Europe had an official judicial torture ban in place. Now, this is where things get interesting, because seemingly the usage and subsequent banning of judicial torture was more or less of a 0 to 100 approach. It really kind of went, torture was being used, and now it's not. And the torture methods that were being used were more or less of a side note, because, well, they were banned now, at least ideally. But that doesn't mean there's not banned methods we can discuss. Just bear with me. You see, following the huge torture ban wave across Europe in the 1800s, we find Europe and the rest of the world experience World War I and then World War II. And following World War II, we see the UN adopting something known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this declaration was officially adopted on December 10th, 1948. And what this declaration was essentially the first global recognition and statement of fundamental human rights globally.
Am I tripping? Or is the fact that basic human rights, global human rights, were put into effect only in 1948? Isn't that kind of insane? That's only 78 years ago. Here's something I'll tell you guys that's kind of sad. Yeah, we have global human rights, but a lot of third world countries, like I'm speaking from experience, bro, like in Pakistan, for example, I don't think there are like global human rights. There are such things as like class systems where people are treated lower than others or have like less rights than others.
This declaration is much longer and much more complex than I could get into in this video. However, one relevant part of this declaration is Article 5, which states, quote, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment," making an extremely cut and dry case on what is and isn't allowed in regards to torture.
Illegals are called aliens in the US still, by the way. That is true. Yeah, that is true. What year did Guantanamo Bay open up? In 2002. I'm sure they'll talk about it in this video, but Guantanamo Bay, I know, is known for having like the worst torture methods ever.
And obviously, nothing is. Article 5 of this declaration essentially stated there is not any situation where torture is ever permitted. Not in wars, not in certain emergencies, and not even in national security situations. Something that we could see as subtle foreshadowing. Now, even though this initial declaration was not legally binding in 1948, it still carried a massive moral and legal influence as it was a globally recognized treaty. However, it wouldn't be long until 1984 that the UN's Convention Against Torture would officially become legally binding, more or less making torture in any place, in any context, of any sort, officially banned globally.
So it didn't. So 1948 they released the document, and in 1984 is when it got officially banned. That's only 42 years ago. 42 years ago, torture got banned.
Something that most would consider a huge W for humanity and society as a whole. But now this is where things get interesting, because even though technically there has been a global ban on torture since 1948, at least according to the UN, I'm sure many of you watching right now are putting the puzzle pieces together.
Yeah, I have.
That a lot of the torture exposed by the US government took place far after the torture ban.
We were just talking about that. You know what's crazy? We were just talking about that. I'm glad the video had realized that. And we banned it, but we've still been committing it. I guarantee you this all still happens today.
I mentioned, historically, torture bans have either been all torture is legal or all torture is illegal. I figured a fun way that we could highlight some specific banned torture methods would be by showcasing some of the torture methods that the United States government got exposed for using either many years or many decades after the multiple global torture bans. One of the earliest and most notable examples of torture conducted by the American government basically right after the ban was Project MK Ultra. For those unfamiliar, MK Ultra was essentially a secret mind control program by the CIA whose sole goal was to try to develop both a truth serum and also to see if it was possible to break the mind of an individual to then rebuild them as your own perfect robot.
Why am I just learning about MK Ultra? Did you guys know about this?
And these would both be beneficial to the United States government for military applications. As dystopian and disturbing as that sounds. During the duration of Project MK Ultra, numerous forms of unique torture took place, with a few notable examples being dosing high levels of LSD and other psychoactive drugs to unwilling and unknown participants to simply see what would happen, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, prolonged hypnosis, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological manipulation. I know I'm just giving a vague overview.
This is dead ass no different from Resident Evil and trying to develop the T-virus. I'm not even joking. That's the whole point of Resident Evil. In Resident Evil, the government wants to make bioweapons, like bioorganic weapons that fight for the government. No, you guys are laughing, but it's the same thing. It's the same thing. Where do you think they got the idea from? No, you know what? You're probably right. Resident Evil probably got the idea from Project MK Ultra. That's insane.
But we seriously have so much ground to cover. However, if you do want more information on MK Ultra, I'll link a video I made below about it.
Dude, I'm going on the MK Ultra rabbit hole tonight. I'm gonna watch like 5 videos about this thing.
I have a whole section about MK Ultra in my video about conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. Regardless, before we move on from Project MK Ultra, it's important to note that many of these methods were used for prolonged amounts of time, once again with the sole goal of breaking the mind and psyche of the unwilling and unknowing participant. And while many of the methods used in MK Ultra were non-physical, some of them were. However, the results were the same. The minds and mental health of the victims of the CIA's torture in MK Ultra were changed forever. And
dude, what the fudge, bro? MK Ultra would be a sick band name. I'm making a band name and calling it MK Ultra. I fear people would just take that. People who know about the MK Ultra, like lore, would just look at it the wrong way.
Many feel that justice for these injustices were never truly served. Another notable and disturbing instance of...
So basically these unfortunate humans just became brain dead. And then what? They just died?
Torture being illegally used by the US government happened in the Phoenix program during the Vietnam War. The Phoenix program, once again, was the product of the CIA. And the goal of this program was to act as a counterinsurgency effort in southern Vietnam. And while the reported main goal was to destroy Viet Cong infrastructure, what largely ended up happening and what ended up being exposed later in congressional hearings was a lot more disturbing than what was initially released. Some very graphic and very illegal torture methods used during the Phoenix program were the following: intense beatings with whips and hoses, rape and sexual violence, water torture, electric shocks, specifically electric shocks to the genitals of a victim.
Dude, are we... And they still did that in Guantanamo Bay too, by the way.
Intentional dog attacks, inserting objects into the ears and brains of certain individuals, and much more. And while those two separate examples of the CIA and US government using extreme force and illegal torture methods is disturbing enough, we're still not done.
What's crazy is at the beginning of this video, I was like, watch all the torture methods be exposed by like the United States, and I was right. So far, 2 for 2 around the United States.
Because we were only now getting into what some would consider the worst of the offenses. You see, due to an event that happened in 2001 in New York that I can't mention because I want to pay my bills, the United States was reasonably very on edge. However, many would consider their response to this feeling of insecurity as so unreasonable, in fact, that the US government would need to rebrand torture so that they wouldn't feel like they were breaking the law. And that's exactly what they did. From 2002 until 2009, the US government knew that they wanted to extract information out of people by any means necessary.
I know we're like kind of like going a little like off topic and like off like to the side a little bit, but like every like 4th of July or whatever, it's like, when people like ask me like, are you like proud to be an American, stuff like that, it's so hard sometimes, bro. When you look at like, because like growing up, I would go to like Pakistan and whatnot, and my cousins would be a lot older than me, and they would know like all the stuff that the country, like that my country's doing, and they know like all the stuff that the government's been doing because they're a lot older and they're more into politics and stuff like that. And then back then you'd be like, yo, what country do you like, America or Pakistan? And I'd be like, oh, I love America. I was born and raised there. Like I love that country. That's where I'm from. And then they're like, oh no, your country sucks. Your country's this. Your country's that. As a kid, you don't really know what you're talking about. But then when you get older and then you learn everything and you learn about what your country's been doing and what they do till this day everywhere around the world, bro, it's so disgusting, man. It's so unfortunate, dude. It is. It's so hard to support this country sometimes, man. It's hard to accept the fact that this is America. Yeah, it's really hard.
But they also knew that torture was frowned upon and illegal. And because they couldn't publicly be saying that they were torturing people, they needed to rebrand it so it sounded okay. And what they came up with was something known as enhanced interrogation techniques.
No, we're not torturing people. We're just enhancing the interrogation techniques on them.
These techniques were more or less unmistakably torture, and that's further bolstered by the fact that these techniques were only used and demonstrated in locations known as CIA black sites. And what these black sites were essentially secret detention centers where the CIA could keep, hold, torture, and kill prisoners and detainees without necessarily being at the immediate scrutiny of, laws. CIA black sites were hidden all across the world. However, the purpose of all of them was the same: gather intelligence by any means necessary. And interestingly, even though the methods that were used were extreme, the results gathered were typically not. Now, what exactly were they doing at these black sites, you may ask? Well, let me give you a list of banned torture methods that were confirmed, or at least highly suspected of being used at these black sites. Waterboarding, which is essentially the act of simulating drowning, or in some case, literally drowning somebody. Sleep deprivation.
Yeah, okay, I've tried getting waterboarded once. I don't think we use enough water because it wasn't that bad. Maybe, you know what? Maybe I should try all these on a stream one day. Trying every single torture method IRL. Maybe I should do a waterboarding stream. Hassan, are you okay mentally? I am okay mentally.
Keeping people up for nearly a week, if not more. Stress positions, essentially keeping a prisoner in a position that is extremely uncomfortable and
holy shit, dude.
Painful. Cramped confinement, similar to a stress position. You're not necessarily being held in a painful position, you're just simply in a location you cannot get comfortable.
That is a painful position. Knowing my knees, I would die in this box. I feel like Twitch would take that down instantly. Actually, you're definitely right. Guys, never mind. The waterboarding stream has been canceled. You know what's the worst part about a lot of these torture methods? Obviously, like, torture is bad in itself, and people being tortured is terrible. What makes things worse is that when it came to like Guantanamo Bay, at least after 9/11, they just picked off any Arab or brown man off the street, whether they were guilty or not. And they just talking about just tortured them, even if they were like innocent. And there have been many cases where people were tortured in Guantanamo Bay and they weren't even criminals. Watching your streams is torture. Nice. Yeah, not even given a trial.
Get comfortable in. In some cases, insects were also involved to add extra discomfort. In many cases, torture would take place on detainees who were naked for extra embarrassment and humiliation. Sensory deprivation was used, typically by putting a hood over the head of the prisoner.
Wait, what was this?
Sensory deprivation was used, typically by putting a hood over the head of the prisoner and playing extremely loud music on repeat and keeping them in complete darkness to essentially overload or underload their senses. Exposing individuals to extreme temperatures, in most cases consistently exposing a prisoner to an ice bath or simply pouring cold water on them as they are in their cell or potentially in their stress position. Restricting food or water, or in some cases simply manipulating the diet of a prisoner where they wouldn't eat or drink through their mouth. They would simply provide hydration and nourishment rectally.
Oh, that's disgusting, man. It's like, you're not gonna stop the next 9/11 by feeding somebody through their butthole, man. And on top of that, too, they probably got the wrong guy.
A countless plethora of other brutal torture methods. Every torture method I just discussed took place in the early 2000s, and were the only ones that were a part of a declassified memo from a Senate report, meaning these definitely weren't the only torture methods that were taking place. They were simply the only ones that were declassified and admitted to. It has been reported that many of these torture methods resulted in the death of detainees in these covert black sites.
What? They died? What? They died from torture?
And due to whistleblowers exposing what was going on behind closed doors.
This guy on TikTok, there was a time earlier this year where all I would get was John Kiriakou videos, and he exposed so much. I was going down a literal rabbit hole of his videos.
In 2009, the Enhanced Interrogation Techniques program was officially disbanded, although I'll leave it up to you to decide if you believe that fully. And in case you wanted a more
it's definitely not been disbanded.
Or informed opinion on the matter, I actually got John Kiriakou himself, the ex-CIA whistleblower, to give his 2 cents on whether or not the CIA is still using these enhanced interrogation techniques.
W Cameo, oh my god, lock in chat.
Hello everybody at Trust Me Bro. I'm John Kiriakou, the CIA torture whistleblower. I've been asked if the CIA continues to use the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, even though they were formally outlawed with passage of the McCain-Feinstein Amendment in December of 2014? The truthful answer is I don't know if those techniques are still used. I hope not. They are patently illegal, besides being immoral and unethical. But we kind of just have to take the CIA's word for it.
Yeah, I'm not taking the CIA's word for it. Are you kidding me, dude? We know the government lies to us, bro. Okay, the cameo is cool, but yeah, he gave us nothing. But that was kind of expected. They don't care. They know no one will do anything. Look at how much we know about the files and what ICE is doing, and nothing has happened. Yeah, literally. I mean, we know what's going on. We know where our tax money goes. We know what's happening in Israel, Palestine. We know what's happening with ICE. We know what's happening literally with all what Maya just said. And what can we do, bro? Like, dude, our government literally posts AI slop on their Twitter accounts.
In your opinion, what were some of the worst methods that were used during your time in the CIA? And for these specific methods, do you still think they're being used or not?
The worst one, well, there are several that are really bad, but the generally accepted worst enhanced interrogation technique was waterboarding. Waterboarding is most likely not used by the CIA, just like hypothermia is not used, where we used to call it the cold cell, where they strip you naked, they chain you to an eye bolt in the ceiling, and then they chill your cell to 50 degrees Fahrenheit and throw a bucket of ice water on you every hour.
Oh my God.
We killed people. We murdered people with that technique.
Yeah, no shit, you murdered and killed people with that technique, bro.
That's not used. Sleep deprivation. The CIA killed people with this technique as well, keeping people awake for as many as 12 days. Well, people begin to lose their minds at day 7 with no sleep.
Am I tripping into thinking that out of all the ones that he's talked about so far, waterboarding seems like the least, like the least worst one? Like, I feel like if I had an option to be tortured from getting either hypothermia, sleep deprivation, or waterboarding, I would choose to be waterboarded.
Begin to die. Their organs begin to shut down at day 9 with no sleep. 12 days without sleep, you're dead.
No, you're literally being suffocated. You want to be waterboarded so bad. I don't want to be waterboarded. I'm just saying, out of all the torture methods, I feel like that would be like the least. You're also least likely to die from waterboarding. No, waterboarding isn't what your friend did to you. Okay, I know. I'm just saying in general, man.
Don't do that anymore. But then there are things like stress positions, belly slaps, insult slaps across the face, shaking. We don't know if those techniques are still used.
All right, you know what? What would you rather choose? You are going to get tortured right now, and you have to choose what you're choosing. Like you're going to get tortured. I feel like I'm not crazy for saying I would rather, out of all these 3 options, I would rather be waterboarded. Can people die from getting waterboarded? I'm curious. Yes. Okay, I'm an idiot. Yes, people have died from waterboarding. While the technique is specifically designed to simulate drowning without crossing the threshold of death, continuing the flow of water uninterrupted causes fatal asphyxiation. Okay, so like basically I'm stupid because I was under the impression that waterboarding doesn't kill you. So let's disregard everything I said for the last 10 minutes.
To the best of our understanding, there are no more secret prisons that the CIA owns and runs around the world. Again, we have to take their word for it. But we do know that terrible things take place at Guantanamo and continue to take place at Guantanamo.
So Guantanamo isn't shut down? I thought it was shut down.
But, all we can do is trust that Congress does the right thing and trust that the CIA follows the law and hope for the best. It doesn't make me feel very warm and fuzzy. Thanks
So basically what he said was, yeah, they're probably still doing it.
for the question. All the best.
Thank you, Mr. Kiriakou, for your time, and now let's wrap up the video. Some individuals claim that the torture committed by the United States government under the Enhanced Interrogation Act was completely justified considering the context of what was going on in the country at the time and what they were responding to. However,
I'm not going to say it, but we all know who thinks that was acceptable at the time. We all know who thinks that.
others claim what the United States government and CIA did was simply not justified and never is under any context. And while that's a debate for another day, if nothing else shows that wherever humans are, torture is not far away. But in case you were curious about other torture methods that were banned, just understand this. Literally any torture method you can think of is illegal. It doesn't matter where it's done or who it's done to, any form of torture in any context, in any setting, in any place is completely forbidden globally. Although, as we know, that doesn't mean that torture can't or won't happen. but it does mean that for the first time in history, there is at least an organized effort to reduce the amount of torture happening globally, which is a good thing. It only took roughly 7,000 years. But in case you were looking for more specific examples of torture...
Oh man, torture's banned globally? That means I can't get waterboarded on my stream anymore.
torture methods, check out the video on screen right now. It's actually the first video I...
You know what? Good video, man. Good video. W video. If you guys enjoyed that, YouTube, subscribe. W reacts.